You're not just sort of forwarding the alert. You're making a judgment call. You're making some human decisions about that data. And that's really, I think, the strength, bringing the heavy lifting of the AI and ML alongside with the nuanced decision-making power of the analyst. The two can go hand in hand really well if you design the system appropriately.
You're listening to KBcast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Joining me today is Dr. Brenton Cooper, CEO and co-founder of Fivecast. And today we're discussing national security, which is now a big data challenge. Brenton, thank you so much for joining. I've heard wonderful things about you in the market. Close friends of mine speak very highly of you, so I'm very glad to have you on the show today when national security and cybersecurity combined makes a very interesting topic.
Carissa, it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
So I want to sort of start with your lay of the land, Brenton, when it comes to national security. So what are your thoughts? Now, typically this is a cybersecurity podcast. I have touched on national security before, but I think it'd be wonderful to get a bit of an overview from yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Carissa. The national security landscape for Australia is evolving really quickly, but it is evolving in a way that a lot of the Western powers are seeing as well. So if you look at some of the communication coming out of the US government, the Department of Homeland Security, they identify like 4 or 5 different themes that are really affecting their national security. And they're quite consistent with what Australia is seeing as well. So those areas you can roughly group into sort of great power competitions. So looking at the rise of China and Russia, transnational organised crime. So think there, human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, drug trafficking, cyber threats to the homeland, which is probably more akin or aligned with that cybersecurity focus that you have. And then foreign influence activity and domestic extremism. They're probably the 5 major threats to national security. And I think Australia is seeing those as we speak.
So talk to me a little bit more about foreign influence. What does that mean specifically?
Well, foreign influence, it's an area that's gaining a lot of attention at the moment. And it's really about non-state or state actors trying to enact some influence over the activities of the democratic processes in Australia, whether that's being to influence the outcome of elections or the outcome of policy decisions. It's influenced by other states trying to change the landscape for that policy setting and how things are being assessed and measured by the government of the day.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting because these are the common questions that people are asking from a cybersecurity perspective, was it a state actor or was it not, or who was it that are conducting some of these cyber breaches that we're reading in the press? So, okay, I want to zoom out just for a second. Now, one of the things that's interesting to me, because I do interview people around the world, different various levels about different things, and it's probably you obviously know a lot more about national security. Now, would you say from your experience that maybe in Australia we're not really discussing this enough? Now, I say this because in the US now, I guess there are reasons for this, that they're a little bit more outward facing when it comes to this, because recently a lot of people actually just, randomly been asking me about what are the current affairs on like national security. And I'm sort of not seeing as much being spoken about it in comparison to the US. Do you have any sort of insight around that?
Well, that's interesting. I see it, most days in the media these days in different forms, whether it's comment on, the Chinese influence in islands and Papua New Guinea. That's been a real topic of conversation recently. Perhaps it's where I'm getting my news. Perhaps that's what's making the difference here. But those sorts of things. And then also, the Russia's foreign policy and invasion of the Ukraine, the Chinese posturing towards Taiwan. They're all major geopolitical events and are getting daily coverage in the media. So, and they all impact Australia's national security.
Sorry, Brenton, just to clarify, would you say that Australia talks about it more than the United States? Or I think that's sort of from my understanding, the US seem to talk about national security more than perhaps Australia does. Would you say that's correct?
Oh, yeah, I'd say that probably is. I mean, the US is a very patriotic society. They have a large military, a large government apparatus. And so there is a bit of a focus on it. I think you see that all their way of life, that the military presence is an ever-present force. Not so much in Australia, and possibly, their focus on foreign policy might be higher because of that as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay, now that definitely makes sense. So, okay, now, as I mentioned at the start of the show, now national security is now a big data challenge. And you mentioned that technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning offer tools to look for needles in haystacks. Now, I always like looking for a needle in a haystack. So what do you mean by this specifically? Like I've got some high level ideas, but I'm keen to hear it from you.
Yeah, I think in this game of law enforcement and intelligence and defence, analysts are being overwhelmed with data. There's so much data coming into them, so much data to be analysed, and really they're facing four major challenges there. It's the volume of the data, the velocity or speed at which it arrives, the variety of the data, and also checking the veracity of the data. So it's sort of the 4 Vs of big data. And whether you're a law enforcement analyst or a military analyst, you're still suffering sort of the same problem. How do you grapple with that data? How do you gain insights from it? And that's where AI and machine learning can really add some value. I was part of a cooperative research centre years ago, and we were looking at data and analytic techniques for the Australia's national security community. And I was speaking with an intel analyst from one of the police forces. This is quite some time ago. And he was telling me about all the great work that he was doing and doing geospatial analysis and network analysis and sort of mapping out the connections between a serious and organised crime network and what they were doing, looking at their online transactions and their banking transactions. And at the time, it was fascinating to hear him speak. It was probably, the most lucid definition of analysis that I'd heard from someone. And I said, oh, great. What sort of tools are you using to do all that wonderful analysis? And he goes, I've got 4 sheets of butcher's paper up on my office wall. So what we're trying to do, I know it was scary, and at the time thinking of the tools that have been given to this person to do their job. And what we want to do with AI and ML is actually make that process a whole lot easier, so that the analysts can be presented with the insights, the process data, all connected together, so they can really quickly get to the problem at hand, and they can apply what humans do best, which is thinking about the nuance, thinking about why was this happening, who was doing it, and then thinking about how do they get to the next level of analysis. So the AI and ML is really there to just enable the analyst and get them quickly insights from the data, so that the analysts can do what they're best at, which is make decisions.
Okay, so a couple of questions in there. Now, you mentioned the 4 Vs. So I've got volume, velocity, veracity. And what was the 4th one?
Variety,
that's right. Thanks for sharing those. I think that's a great way to approach it and easy to remember. Now, I want to get into, what about alert fatigue? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I've spoken to a number of people, whether it's OSINT related, but also people that, work in threat intelligence, about alert fatigue. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, alert fatigue's a valid concern. And really that relates to having some sort of system sift through data and then provide automated streams of alerts that have to be reviewed by the analyst. And obviously, if those alerts are coming in and there's too many what we call false positives, alerts that don't actually relate to a threat, then the analyst will quickly tune out from those alerts. So there's a balance to be gained between getting good coverage of the actual problem, but then not overwhelming the analyst with too many false alarms. So that's one particular style of using AI and ML, is to provide alerts to an analyst to look at. There's another style, which is probably more along the lines of what I was talking to, which is really providing the analyst with processing tools or process data so that they can essentially noodle around in the data and find the alert themselves almost, find out what's interesting in the data because it's already been pre-processed and contextualized for them.
I was going to my next question around false positives, but you definitely answered that. Now, I've used to be a reporting analyst, so I understand data. I understand about, what we should focus on, how to tell that story. Would you say then maybe people historically haven't, like you mentioned before, around the right types of alerts that people should be focused on? Would you say that perhaps people have missed what to focus on? They've sort of maybe focus on the wrong type of alert which tells that story, because then once you get that story, you can create that narrative, which then gives insights. Potentially if you're working in consulting and you're presenting it back to your client, but also if you're internal as well. I mean, I used to be internal, so I used to pull all this data, find out what was important about it. And I wasn't just reporting on it, because reporting's one thing, but then it's like, okay, well, I actually derive some insights from this. Like, what does this actually mean? Do you have any sort of insight on that or anything you're sort of doing in that space?
Yeah, I think it's a really important distinction, and it sort of relates to your alert fatigue question, is that, we shouldn't really be viewing AI and ML as one of my tradecraft advisors here at Fivecast. He talks about the do my job button. It's not about getting artificial intelligence and machine learning to do the job of the analyst. We're not trying to do that. If anyone's hoping that you can do that, you're probably sort of barking up the wrong tree, so to speak. What we really want is to use the AI and ML to sort of simplify the decision process. Still have the analyst making the decision, processing and refining the insights, just as you mentioned. You're reporting on it. You're not just sort of forwarding the alert. You're making a judgment call. You're making some human decisions about that data. And that's really, I think, the strength, bringing the heavy lifting of the AI and ML alongside with the nuanced decision-making power of the analyst. The two can go hand in hand really well if you design the system appropriately.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Brenton. Now, I'm really curious, how do you sort of decide like what's important, like what alerts you should be focusing on to then, derive some insights from it and to sort of really inspect that a little bit more? How does that sort of conversation start?
Yeah, there's probably two ways to view it. The first is obviously we need to be guided by subject matter experts. So if you're looking at a particular problem, whether it's a cyber monitoring system or a human trafficking system, you want to understand and then sort of try and codify the knowledge of the human analyst, because they're the experts at it. So what is interesting to them? What are they looking for when they're doing their analysis? What are the indicators that they're looking for? And with that, we can use the AI or the machine learning to try and extract those indicators from the data. Once we've got those, we can then use processes like clustering or classification to try and group up multiple indicators. So you get a sort of a compilation of results, if you want, that reinforce each other. And that's where the AI and machine learning can really sort of add an extra layer of filtering, an extra layer of confidence on the data that's being presented to the analyst. But at its heart, it's a process that's driven by the knowledge that the analyst has to start with.
Okay, yeah, so that's really interesting. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. So basically, after, AI, ML do their job, you get clustering and classification, which effectively is like a thematic theme. So you have to start to see trends. Is that right?
Well, it depends what you're looking for. If you're after sort of a thematic situational awareness picture, then absolutely. But if you're down looking at individual behaviours, you can still look for those indicators. Those indicators, whether it's, for example, you might be looking at progression towards extremism. People go away and codify up. What are the indicators that you should be looking at? So they can be quite specific to the investigation or the case you're looking at, or they could be more strategic and more thematic as well. So it really depends on the scenario that you're trying to build a solution for.
Wow, that is really interesting. Now, I'm just going to ask, because that's my job, is push the envelope. Do you, could you sort of give an example? So you talk about extremism. Is there anything specific that sort of stands out that you look for, that you notice, or is there anything you can share?
Oh, look, probably not. Some of the agencies we work with, their expertise is in building up those indicators. I think they might consider that their special sauce.
Now I'd like to address how the big data challenge lends itself to problems that exist in cybersecurity and national security. Now, I sort of touched on this before. When you combine the two, they become more powerful. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts, because you are on, the other side of the fence that people I don't typically, interview. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts.
Well, you sort of touched on cybersecurity there, and obviously there's the recent Optus breach and the data breach from Medibank, and that's one type of sort of cybersecurity risk. And there's a whole range of approaches you can take to look at that sort of data leakage, whether it's protection from malicious insiders or advanced persistent threats. And you want to try and flag that as to the operator as a suspicious activity. More broadly, if we look at, and this is probably continuing the theme that I've got here, if we look at some work that we were doing for, US SOCOM, they have this concept of a hyper-enabled operator. And it's really trying to put the human at the center of the decision making and present them with the right data at the right time and in the right context. Really, that comes down to understanding what their job is, understanding the decisions that they're trying to make, and then working out how do you process the raw data that they are trying to make those decisions upon? How do you process it and put it into a context which makes it easy for them to make those decisions? In some ways, just to sort of make that tangible, some of your listeners might be familiar with the outputs of the Google Knowledge Graph. So when you do you open up Google and you do a search on your favorite sporting team. So for me, it could be the Adelaide Crows or the Brooklyn Nets basketball team. The Google Knowledge Graph has gone out and sort of processed all of the information that's available on that particular sporting team and extracted sort of key actors, key events, key entities from it. So, and then they summarize that all in a pane of information on the side of the Google search results. So if you type in Brooklyn Nets, you'll quickly get a view of, who's on their playing roster, who's the current team, who's the coach, potentially what's the salary cap that they're working on, what are their last 5 game results, where do they sit in the ladder. All of that has been automatically extracted and then summarized into the Google Knowledge Graph. And that's the type of capability that AI and machine learning can bring to problems in cybersecurity and national security.
So bringing them closer together.
Yeah, absolutely. Bring them closer together.
So before I get into that, because that's where it gets really interesting from my perspective, you mentioned before that there's a do my job button. Would you say that people, and I mean, it's not their fault, people are, they're busy, they're trying to get their head above the water, especially when you get into the cyber world. Would you say that people sort of fall back on, well, I've just got to, do my job button because I don't really have that much time? Are you seeing a bit of that as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's always elements of that, and there are systems that sell themselves as a, here's a do my job button. We try and avoid that sort of approach. We sort of try and avoid that language as well. And really, it's about trying to make the job easier rather than doing the job. So I still think you can't remove the analyst's decision making capabilities and process from that final output. And anyone that is selling the do my job button is probably selling a bit of false hope, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when people think of artificial intelligence and machine learning, they think like, oh no, a job's going to be replaced. I'm like, well, no, it's actually going to be that they're going to be doing like more low-level stuff, like, analyzing some of this data at that macro level, and then can sort of really then, the analysts can come in and really hone in on that at that micro level. And there's still going to be things that gets missed, and there's still going to be things, not everything is addressed, right? So I think that that's the importance of having someone there to actually make sure, like, yes, that makes sense, and to focus on, again, like what are those main sort of ingredients that you spoke about before, and like you said, getting back to whether it's something specific or it is that thematic theme that we're focusing on. So I think that, again, people have asked me about this in the past, like, no, we shouldn't be worried about our jobs being taken away. We should actually be focused on doing more strategic things rather than perhaps things are a little bit more stock stand and a little bit more mundane, and there's a level of banality in doing those types of jobs.
Absolutely, Chris. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. In any way, I think AI and ML, the introduction of it into national security, will just make people's jobs easier. It'll make them more interesting. It'll make them more effective. Their job is still there. It just removes all of that mundane data processing that people spend so much time on today. So they'll effectively be able to do far much more in the time that they've got.
So I now want to focus on, with everything that's been going on, you touched on it before, where would you say the biggest gaps are with cyber and national security in Australia?
Well, I think one of the big gaps is looking at different types of information. So national security agencies, they're obviously tasked with protecting communities, but possibly, the use of classified intelligence has become less effective in recent years. It costs more, it's harder to get. And I think there's an increasing recognition that publicly available information or from online platforms is useful in the context of national security and cyber intelligence. And so I'd see that there's, one of the gaps is really pivoting the organisations to focus much more on the collection and analysis of online information.
So you said it costs more. Why does it cost more?
Well, to deploy a satellite or, deploy a human intelligence operator is a costly exercise. But to sit there and try and understand from a distance, how the Chinese are trying to influence the Solomon Islands, it's relatively easy to do by looking at public statements, look at social media, look at online forums, for example, and you get a fairly good picture of what's happening. I was in a meeting recently with a retired director of the defence intelligence over in the US, and he said that 85% of the content in intelligence reporting could be garnered from open sources. So that's a big, significant chunk that could be pivoted away from expensive collection platforms and move to online collection and analysis.
So this is the move towards OSINT, or open source intelligence. Would you say that people, I have spoken about OSINT in the past, probably not as prolifically as what you're talking about it every single day, but would you say that people still don't maybe understand what OSINT or open source intelligence really is?
Yeah, definitely. It's an evolving field and it's an increasingly relevant capability. So I think people from the national security agencies have a natural resistance to it, really about that fourth V, the veracity of the data. Do you know who's actually putting that information into the online sphere? Do you know if they're doing it with what sort of intent? So that's one of the challenges I think that the national security community have been facing. But if you look at sort of even at law enforcement sort of level, sort of domestic law enforcement, state law enforcement, there's a huge amount of valuable information that can be garnered from open source intelligence that can be used to solve crimes, whether that's drug trafficking, whether that's people trafficking, whether it's homicides. We've got examples, not that I can speak about them openly, but of our customers using open source intelligence to achieve those outcomes for law enforcement and overcoming that challenge around veracity of the data.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Now, I don't know whether you watched in the mainstream media a couple of weeks ago, there was a lady that went to an insurance company and said that she was in a car accident, I don't know, her leg was injured or something, and then she needed to get further compensation. Then obviously, whether it was OSINT or it was something along those lines, that actually saw on her social media that she was climbing the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which obviously would indicate that her leg's fine. Would you say that's an example of how, for especially around the law enforcement side of things, or potentially people committing, in this case, it would be fraud, is that an example of how OSINT works?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good example. Obviously in that case, they've been able to, not that I know the specifics, but in that case, it would seem that they've been able to, identify the person's online footprint, look at the activities that person's putting out there in the public sphere, public space, and doing it of their own volition. And with that information can go back and sort of, counter the claim for personal injury. So that's definitely an example of how it's being used, probably in that case more in the commercial space for fraud detection. But I think there's similar examples that can be used in the government space as well.
Yeah, and I think that I've tried to explain this to people before around their digital footprint, what's online. Like, I'm not using heavy tooling that you guys are at Fivecast, but even just for me, like if I wanted to sort of find something out about people, there's ways and mechanisms to sort of start to pull together the narrative and the story about someone. So this is me doing it at a very basic, rudimentary level. But when you're starting to get into the capability that you guys offer, that's when you can start to look at things more seriously in a lot more depth. And I guess there's just a lot more complexity with what the stuff that you guys do, which then lends itself to it's super powerful.
Yeah, and I think there's some big industry and societal trends that are supporting that. People, obviously social media is relatively new. Online news is increasing. And when I say relatively new, the last 10 years. But there is a trend to, talk more, put more information into the public realm. And that can be used for, obviously great purposes to let people communicate. But there's always this sort of small subgroup in any community where they're communicating about, things that are threats to the community. And that's really where our customers of Fivecast are interested in trying to find those, those really bad areas of the online sphere where people are undertaking malicious activities.
I heard through someone else as well, like back in the day when we had 9/11, that like Al Qaeda used to like communicate through like closed Facebook groups, which I just found super bizarre. Like, do you know anything about that? Like, that just seems like what? But I mean, this is going back a long time ago. But apparently, like, to get into the group, like, there was a bit of a process. Like, you didn't just sort of request it and you were in. Like, you had to obviously create a pseudonym account. You had to do all this type of stuff to look legitimate. People eventually got in. I remember I was reading something about this, but I'm just like, that just feels so risky to me.
Yeah, I mean, it still happens, probably less so on, the big social media platforms. What we're probably seeing is more and more of that type of activity, even within closed groups, is being moved to the fringe platforms, whether that's, Telegram and Gab and Discord or things like that. But it's not so prevalent on the major platforms as that's our observation.
Yeah, definitely not nowadays, because I mean, AI and machine learning probably flagged that type of commentary that's being like put on there. I mean, this was going back like a long time ago, but I just found that really bizarre. So, okay, now I want to understand from you, like, where do you believe there could be better alignment in the space between cyber and national security?
Yeah, probably the better alignment, particularly from our perspective, from Fivecast perspective, is about looking into this online world and trying to understand how cyber influence is occurring and how that affects the national security of Australia. So that's probably the main focus of us is looking at democratic resilience, influence campaigns, misinformation campaigns, those types of concerns in the online world.
Now, when you say misinformation, do you mean information warfare?
Yeah, absolutely. So information warfare is a big area of concern for governments around the world. It's some people call it the grey zone, if you want, where it's a conflict in the online world rather than the real world. And it's a tool that's used by non-state actors and state actors across the world as a very easy to deploy and hard to stop technique.
Yeah, so I've done an interview recently. It was actually in the public now it was Stan Woods, who's the head of intelligence from F5, and the whole sort of conversation was around 8 and 10 Twitter accounts are fake, they're bots. And what he explained was, yes, fake followers is one thing, but moving beyond that is actually around how that, if you're controlling like, I don't know, 1 million Twitter accounts, you can actually then create a narrative where it gets really scary. And then he sort of spoke at a very high level around the campaigns that were run in the US, like how these types of bots then can, the information warfare can influence people's decision. And I mean, it's nothing like what draws a crowd like a crowd. So if I start saying something and then 10 other people join me and then 30 other people, then all of a sudden everyone's going to start saying the same thing. And I think that maybe when you're looking at stuff online, maybe it's hard to detect. Like some of these bots, like they do look somewhat like pretty real, right? If you're not looking at it like through your lens or my lens, like if you're just like an everyday Australian, you're not really thinking on those levels. So I think this is the stuff that's really interesting, not just from I bought fake followers perspective, but more so what that information warfare can actually be used to particularly manipulate a story and a narrative, which may be completely false.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also there's this concept of echo chambers where the same sort of narrative gets reproduced and then amplified within a small community, if you want. And so if you're just your average Twitter subscriber and you jump in and you start searching around and you find yourself in one of these echo chambers, then you can see this same message coming at you from multiple different spots. And some of those will be valid real world accounts with credentials and credibility, and they may have picked up that message from some of those bot accounts to start with. So it's that transition from the bot world into the real world that also makes it very difficult to understand where the messages are coming from.
Yeah, this is where it gets so interesting. So, for example, social media giants, their whole play is to, for example, you like Labradors. They're going to then feed you more Labradors to keep you on the platform because they can charge advertisers more. Like there's this whole theory to it, which I think maybe people seem to forget. And then what does that then create? The echo chamber that you're seeing more Labradors, and Labradors are the best. And then one thing that concerns me though is how do we then like validate like what's real and then what's not that real, perhaps. And I know, and I say this because, and I think even with my interview with Dan, for example, you know, back in the day when there's no social media, we only had like media companies that we could listen to. But now like everyone's got social media, everyone then has a voice and opinion, which is absolutely fine and valid. But that if I'm sort of saying up there and I'm manipulating a million Twitter accounts that Labradors are the best, then other people are just going to start buying into it. So do you think that people may get to a stage where they become so like delusional, like with what's correct and not?
Well, you know, firstly, Chris, I've got a Labrador, and Labradors are the best. So
I did not know that, by the way. I literally just made that. I swear I didn't do any OSINT on you before this interview.
There you go. No, I mean it's a really valid concern, and I know there's some work underway to look at, you know, structural changes to it. So how do you know, debunk messages or rumours in the online world? And there's efforts to sort of counter that, but it's a really hard thing to do, and until you can sort of build in some trust into those social media platforms, and trust to the sources verifying or validating their message, it's going to be really hard for the average consumer to work out what is real and what's not real. And you make a good point. You know, back in the old days, people got a lot of their news, a lot of their information from trusted sources. You know, the ABC or the BBC comes with a level of trust and understanding of, you know, that's a you know, probably a well-researched, well-thought through you know, opinion piece or facts. In the online world, it's hard to do that. So it's a real challenge. There hopefully will be some structural solutions to it, but I think they're many, many years away. And so we're in this space of, you know, how do we grapple with that problem today?
And like I say that because like even speaking to my friends that, or people that I know, for example, I know someone that you meet at a barbecue or something that doesn't know you and you start talking to them, and then it's just maybe the line of thinking and like how I approach things is just very different. But I'm also from a cybersecurity background, so my level of thinking is like, okay, everyone's guilty until proven innocent type of thing. But then when you're talking to someone else, again, at some like backyard barbecue, you're just like, well, they're just easily convinced on what someone said online. It's like, well, who is this person? Like, there could be anyone that just has an opinion that may have a big following, and all of a sudden that's that influence piece now coming in. And I really do think a lot of these big companies, tech companies, have got a lot to answer for, because I guess they've then disseminated, like I said, misinformation. And now we've got 8 and 10 Twitter accounts that are fake, which then creates the information warfare side of things. So, I mean, I don't know. And now that you got Elon Musk then coming in and changing Twitter, and there's no censorship, there's no this and that. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm just looking at these things. I'm interviewing people like yourself to just really just get some insights around what does all this mean?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, and something that, you know, governments and national security agencies have to deal with, because it has real world ramifications. I think there are examples during the Clinton-Trump campaign over in the US where foreign agencies were creating protest events, you know, spending a few dollars for a few Twitter accounts and setting up, you know, followers and groups, and then putting out a message and actually getting people to arrive at a protest in the US. And it was all run out of, you know, the Russian Internet Agency. So it's a very, very difficult problem, and it has real world consequences.
Yeah, and I think that's what people probably aren't thinking about. And that's why I have the purpose of the show, to interview people like yourself to give us those insights. So then what would be your thoughts then to encourage like better alignment then? I mean, you touched on it before with the national and cybersecurity have better alignment, but do you have sort of like any advice perhaps?
Look, Carissa, not off the top of my head, we have advice for the national security agencies. It's you know, for the consumers, I think you really have to think about, you know, where you're getting your messages from. Can you know, spend a little bit of time to dig a little bit deeper into, you know, who they are, what have they said before? Does all of that look sensible to you before you start sort of going on and joining that echo chamber or, you know, espousing the message yourself? So it's maybe a little bit of more personal security, if you want, you know, and validating, as you say, you know, guilty until proven innocent.
But what about in the terms of like, how can cybersecurity and national security, from your perspective, sort of work in a little bit more lockstep?
Yeah, well, I do think that, and I am seeing some examples of this where there is a lot more focus from defence, from government agencies, looking at how the online world can really influence the real world. So there I'm thinking about, issues around democratic resilience. How can Australia's democratic processes, the governmental processes, be negatively affected by the online sphere and discussions there, and then what processes can we take to actually strengthen the democratic processes in Australia, whether that's actually monitoring these influence campaigns, detecting them, and then countering them in their early stages. So both a technology response and also, people out there talking to those who are being targeted, conveying real information about the issues at hand. So there is that alignment happening. I see it in the response that the government's taking and some of the funding decisions that they're making as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. I'm really keen to see how that unfolds. So in terms of any closing comments or final thoughts, is there anything, Brenton, you'd like to leave our audience with today?
The one thing I'd like to say is that for us, the online world is a key part of national security, and people need to, I think, be cognizant when they're out there engaging in Twitter and Facebook and these sorts of things, thinking about where the information that they're consuming has come from. How does it sit with other information that they're receiving, be it from personal interactions or be it from newspapers and TV channels? Is it consistent? Before you start believing in what you see online, because it's a wild west in the online world.
Most definitely, and there's nothing crueler than reading comments on YouTube. So I'm definitely with you when you say Wild West. So thank you so much for your time, Brenton. I think it was really interesting and really important to have you on the show today to sort of look at national security and how that really lends itself to the cybersecurity. So I think that's a really important message that you shared with my audience today. So thank you so much for coming on the show, and thanks for your time and your insights today.
Carissa, thanks very much.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes.
This podcast is brought to you by MERCSEC, the specialists in security, search, and recruitment solutions. Visit mercsec.com to connect today.
If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.